We've got a ton of news to talk about today. One of the most interesting things being a leak for the 9800X3D CPU full review. Not just one thing, but a full review. But not done in the traditional manner. This is not necessarily GPU-limited testing. They're attempting to look at more of a real-world use case, which is very interesting. But we also have headlines talking about NVIDIA's RTX 50 Blackwell gaming GPUs reportedly launching soon. What do I make of that? We have the PlayStation 5 Pro specs leaking ahead of time, including a full teardown, and there is something in here, specifically some extra DDR5 that we were not necessarily expecting, and I think this could potentially have some implications for PC hardware and which GPUs you might want to focus on if you're going to be playing games at the highest settings. And then, we got some other stories to cover, but I think those are the most interesting ones. Let's circle back around to this one, because I think this is really fascinating, not just because this is a review for the 9800X3D a day ahead of schedule, but also because this review is approached in a completely different manner than a typical CPU review. And I don't necessarily think this is by itself better, but I think this is a very interesting complement to a more traditional CPU review. What do I mean? In a traditional CPU review, you try to use settings that create as much of a CPU-limited scenario as possible so that you can measure when gaming is CPU-limited, how much faster is each CPU. This can allow you to identify which CPU is the fastest, and so if you're buying at a certain price range, you can buy the fastest CPU at that price range. This is the right way to do a general CPU review. However, a lot of times people have pushback on that's not showing you what a typical gaming scenario would look like, which seems to be what this review is focusing on. And again, these are two different things, but both of them can provide interesting and useful information. So this review is very interesting because, first of all, the settings they're using, 1440p, not 1080p or 720p, so you're less likely to be CPU limited, at least for the average frame rates. Also, they're not on a 4090. They're on a 4070 Ti, so more like a high-end, but not like ridiculously out of most people's price range build. In other words, a 4070 Ti at 1440p resolution. What would be the difference between having two CPUs in the system? Again, I'm not saying this is the right way to do an overall CPU review, but I think it's an interesting complement to a more traditional CPU review. Because what they show is that the average frame rates are about the same. Less than 1% difference here in Cyberpunk, for example. Now, what are they comparing? The 9700X and the 9800X3D. So basically, is it worth getting the X3D part instead of saving money and getting the 9700X? You could look at it as that type of a question. In your actual build as it is, in actual normal gaming situations, would you notice the difference? And the average FPS says no, because we're mostly GPU limited. But where CPUs often show their differences in a more traditional situation is in frame rate spikes, little stutters. And that's what we're seeing here with the 1% lows and the 0.1% lows. So interestingly, the 9800X3D has noticeably better 0.1% lows, and especially 1% lows here in Cyberpunk, 10% increase in 1% lows and a 5.6% increase in 0.1% lows. Indicating that you would have fewer frame time spikes. Your overall gaming experience would be more consistent, even though the average frame rates aren't increasing. So like I said, this is an interesting way of looking at a CPU review, and it's showing one of the benefits you might actually notice on an X3D chip, or just in general a faster processor, even if the overall gameplay is mostly GPU limited. Sometimes you get those momentary spikes of CPU limited performance, and that's pretty interesting. They test out a number of games here, and all my sources will be linked in the video description. They test out Starfield, where it's actually a massive difference. They're showing the average frame rates, the 9800X3D is actually 1% slower, or in other words, effectively the same. There's always run-to-run variance, etc., so a 1% difference doesn't really mean anything. But in the 1% lows, they're improving from 64 to 82, which is almost a 28% performance increase in the 1% lows, and the 0.1% lows are increasing from 40.5 to 61.2. That's an over 50% increase. So again, a much smoother gaming experience even if the average frame rates are about the same in a real-world test case. So interesting. They've also got Project Cars, where this one's more CPU limited in general. We can see that the average frame rate is increasing by 11%. That doesn't mean the 9800X3D is only 11% faster, though. That's just, there can often be a combination between CPU and GPU limited stuff happening, within the same game as your scene-to-scene stuff changes, right? So, but if we look at the 1% lows and 0.1% lows, we're seeing a 25% and 78% increase in those measurements. That's actually fairly massive. And in Counter-Strike 2, they're seeing the average frame rates increase by 15%, but the 1% lows increase by 29%, and the 0.1% lows increase by about 29%. So I do have to mention that, this is not my testing. This is a leaked review. Well, not even necessarily leaked, but just somebody seems to have violated the review embargo, assuming all these numbers are accurate, not just made up or anything, right? But anyway, that's interesting. They also look at the more productivity-focused workloads, where in general there's not a massive difference between the 9700X and the 9800X3D, although the 9800X3D is showing 5% better performance in multi-threading and similar performance overall in the Blender results. So anyway, that's certainly interesting. It'll be fun to see the full CPU reviews. Tomorrow, I believe, is when the review embargo actually lifts on the 6th. However, I don't actually, that's what's rumored. I don't review CPUs, so I actually don't have the insider AMD information on all of this because I don't do CPU reviews themselves. Anyway, that's pretty interesting. Now, as this part comes out, we need to take another full look at the CPU landscape, because the 9000 series parts, the non-3D parts, were initially met with the reaction of, well, just buy the 7000 series, they perform about the same and they cost a lot less. Well, it's being reported here at videocards.com that a lot of these prices are already down significantly since launch, especially if you factor in some discount codes available at places like Newegg, which looks like some already kind of early Black Friday. Sometimes for some places it seems like November is just your Black Friday deals. Anyway, so we're already seeing some pretty significant discounts compared to launch prices for the 9000 non-X3D parts, which is what they needed to kind of be reasonable. But still, if you can buy the 7000 series parts for less, it still probably makes sense to do that. But we're starting to get there. And eventually the 7000 series will probably sell out. But let's move into some other news, which is we're seeing headlines like the Blackwell gaming GPUs reportedly launching soon. Where is this coming from? Well, it's coming from a leak, not an official announcement, although that leak is, as these things go, one of the better sources. It's Compite7 Kimmy. However, he's just saying we will meet GeForce of Blackwell soon. Now, soon could mean literally anything, so this could just be a random post with no actual new information or even behind-the-scenes information. But if we did want to generously say, what could this mean? I mean, overall, we're expecting NVIDIA to be announcing that and launching more around CES, so like January of 2025. However, sometimes NVIDIA will officially reveal a little bit of information about stuff, like officially say, hey, these things are coming, and then give you more of the information when there's a more full announcement. So it's possible that this could be indicating that NVIDIA is going to at least officially acknowledge that there will be a Blackwell GeForce, RTX 50 series coming, and then maybe say that, more information at CES or some other event or something like that. But anyway, the point is there's some big headlines here, but I don't feel like there's a lot of actual information in it. So let's go ahead and move along. So let's look at what the GPU market is actually like right now, because we do have the latest Steam hardware survey, and these are always fun to take a look at, especially when we track, what are the most popular GPUs out there. And there is some movement. You can actually see the RTX 4060 laptop GPU specifically has moved into second place, with the RTX 3060 GPU still taking first place. Now, that's definitely changed from last month, and also We see the RTX 4060 non-laptop GPU rounding out third place. So if you combine those 4060s, they're definitely actually a pretty huge, and I think would be around first place overall. But again, they aren't combined; the laptop's separate. But this also brought something to my mind that I think I should talk about when I see people discussing the Steam hardware survey. Because a lot of times people feel like there's a massive disconnect between when I go to like Build a PC subreddits or YouTube channels and look at the comments or even what YouTubers are recommending. And a lot of times in these more mainstream price segments, you get a lot of recommendations for AMD parts. I mean, look at my GPU buying guides. I usually start recommending NVIDIA once we get to like the $600 plus range. But down in this, lower price ranges, I generally am recommending AMD. And yet these are dominating the charts, so there's kind of a disconnect there. And part of it is just mind share and all of that. But notice this is laptop GPUs in second place here. And laptops are a type of pre-built system. In other words, remember that there's a massive difference between the DIY market, where you buy a GPU separately and you put it into your own system, and what everybody else is doing. And I don't have specific numbers on this to pull up right now, but I would argue that the pre-built systems, whether it's a pre-built desktop or just buying a gaming laptop, is probably a massively larger market than the I'm buying a GPU separately market. And I know when I walk down the aisles at like Costco or even like Walmart or someplace like that, where a lot of just normal people might buy a gaming PC or parents might buy one for their kid, it's almost always NVIDIA GPUs and often like an RTX 4060, especially if I look at like the gaming laptops available and things like that. So that's definitely one thing to notice when you're looking into this. This represents what people are using on Steam, not the DIY market sales, which is interesting. And along that note, I actually found this particularly interesting because apparently in China, AMD is selling their own pre-built systems, and there's NVIDIA GPUs on offer with AMD's own pre-built systems, which I just thought was an interesting little anecdote here. Anyway, so yeah, definitely something to keep in mind. But if you are shopping for a new GPU, I do think that VRAM could potentially become more important now that the PS5 Pro is launching and we get a look at its actual specs. Because there's something here that I don't remember from the leaked specs, and that's an extra 2 gigabytes of DDR5 memory. So the reason I'm bringing this up is because consoles tend to be the lead development platform for game companies, right? They're focused mostly on consoles, and then they kind of worry about how that runs on PC. And even in the console space, PlayStation tends to have the larger install base, so PlayStation tends to be the lead development platform when they're making their big game design decisions and what kind of stuff to do with the art and everything like that. The point is that consoles use unified memory. The PlayStation 5 has had 16 gigabytes of unified memory, which is shared between normal system functions like normal RAM and as VRAM for the GPU. However, with the addition of 2 gigabytes of system memory here, I would imagine that then more of the 16 gigabytes of graphics memory could be dedicated to actual use as VRAM. In a lot of games, PlayStation 5 would tend to use maybe more like 12 gigabytes of VRAM, and then the rest could be allocated to other stuff, if that makes sense, more like the system RAM types of things. Here, the addition of this extra 2 gigabytes of VRAM, to me, makes it much more likely that you could see 14 or maybe even 16 gigabytes of VRAM targeted on the PlayStation 5 Pro versions of games. Now, I don't think the PS5 Pro is going to have a massive install base, but if the ultra settings of a game are maybe going to be now targeted more towards what the PS5 Pro is capable of, which is certainly a possibility, it's possible that those ultra settings, or in other words, the PS5 Pro settings, could end up needing more than 12 gigabytes of VRAM. So That's interesting because that tends to be one of the big differences between which GPU you're buying, and AMD tends to be a lot more generous as far as how much VRAM you're getting. Now, this again probably depends on the graphic settings that you're using. So it generally tends to be the case if you're willing to turn down certain key graphic settings that you're fine on a lower VRAM amount. But I wonder if we'll start to see more games targeting the PS5 Pro for a top settings list, and that could indicate that those could be a little more VRAM hungry than what we've been seeing up until now with this console generation. So that's just something to keep an eye out for. Another thing that I'm seeing a lot of people highlight here is that, wait, the GPU is only 16.7 teraflops? All the leaks said it was, 33 point something teraflops. Now, my understanding of that is just a different way of calculating the teraflops. Where on AMD GPU hardware, they tend to use the dual issue compute, which would kind of, I think, effectively double the teraflops. I'm not an absolute expert on this, and this seems to be just reporting it without that dual issue factored in. So I don't think this actually means it's a weaker GPU than what was leaked. I think it's just reporting that differently. Also, it's up to a 390 watt power supply on that spec list, so that could be a little more power hungry than we initially expected. This is also from people breaking embargoes, where there was supposed to be unboxings allowed for the PS5 Pro, but we do have a source that went ahead and completely dismantled the whole thing, which is interesting, and reported on some additional specs. So anyway, again, all my sources will be linked in the video description. Now, speaking of games and PlayStation and all of that, if they wanted to make a massive amount of money on PC specifically, they should really do a PC version of Bloodborne. And it'd be nice if they do it before the emulators are already doing it better, right? Because there's been a massive amount of progress on a Bloodborne emulation on PC. And it looks like we're getting just more and more evidence that that's going well. But it would be nice to actually just be able to buy Bloodborne on PC, have it perform well, and maybe even have some graphics updates, kind of a remaster. This would be a game people wouldn't fight you on a remaster for. So can we put some development effort into a Bloodborne PC port officially? And then I'll also mention that just graphics are continuing to push boundaries. Look at this Rome demo. Here's just a screenshot of it, but you can do some pretty crazy things if you have the horsepower to compute it. The question is, do we have that horsepower to compute it, and what will it cost, and is development slowing down, and all of that? I don't know, we'll see, but yeah, this did look like a pretty impressive Unreal Engine 5 demonstration, and I think that's what I've got for you guys today. Hopefully you all have an excellent day, and possibly see you tomorrow if I have thoughts on the 9800X3D reviews. We'll have to see.